Hello and welcome to the show. Now, I'm delighted that my guest this week is Britain's most prolific historian. Jeremy Black was a professor at Durham and then at Exeter University, and he has written some 200 books on virtually all aspects of history. Thank you so much for coming.
Great pleasure.
Today. Thank you very much for coming, Jeremy. Going to talk about your latest books a little bit, but I'm going to really sort of ask you what sounds like a crude exam question, if you like. But as a historian, when you look at the situation now that we are in this country, we've just had the election in America with Trump, and you look at Britain, would you say that Britain's perceived decline is absolutely unstoppable?
Well, actually, that's a really interesting question because I was asked the very same question by the chargé d'affaires of one of our leading allies, let's just say that, within the last week.
Really?
And he actually said to me, is Britain's decline stoppable?
Yeah.
And he also said that in his mind, and he was an Anglophile, in his mind, Britain was becoming a museum.
Right.
I think there are fundamental problems. I think one of the fundamental problems is a state can only do well if its economy is functioning. If you load the economy with a myriad of other policies, social policies, cultural policies, then you run the risk of making it uneconomic. And as we know, once you have a non-performing economy or a poorly performing economy or an economy in which there are one or two good sectors, but a lot of it isn't doing well, then the decline can be very rapid. I mean, a good example of that is Argentina. Argentina in 1910 was one of the more successful countries in the world. Argentina by 1950 was a basket case.
Right.
And the danger is we might go the same way, and I don't think people have really understood that.
Is it purely an economic thing, though? You see, because it seems...
So it's certainly not purely an economic thing. But the point I would bring up is that the economy is one of the fundamental aspects. Now, many of the problems for the economy arise from social and cultural issues.
Right.
So, for example, in Britain, I would suggest the role of the state is too big. There is a very poorly operating state. And I have to say, this has been the case under the present government, the Labour government. It wasn't exactly as though the Conservative predecessors did brilliantly under that. There's been a poorly performing state taking too large a percentage of national resources. And that, of course, the taxation has to come from somewhere for that. That presses on the productive economy. So I think that there is a major problem there. And I think there's also issues of cultural cohesion, because if a society is in, I would say, both absolute and relative decline, but if it is in decline, and you can debate the rate of decline, clearly the way that is coped with by people, communities, families, the country as a whole, reflects cultural cohesion or its absence. Now, you can see this in all sorts of different ways. One of the more interesting ways at the moment is the extent to which talented young people are leaving in order to pursue careers in places like Australia. Every single loss of a talented young individual or family is a problem for the country. No two ways about it. I mean, obviously, we are having large tranches of immigration, and some immigrants perform very valuable functions and integrate into society, but many do not. And, there are practical problems in that respect. Another aspect that is very important to the operation of society and the economy as a whole is belief in the rule of law, belief in law and order. Now, clearly, it's not just that there are the economic costs, there are the strains on social and cultural cohesion. If criminality is rising, if on basic level, for example, something well reported over the last 3 months, the enormously high rate of shoplifting that is going on. Every single firm that is losing X million pounds for shoplifting, it affects their profitability, it affects the tax yield. It is not a good thing. And yet you will find commentators out there suggesting it's not serious, that it's a kind of counterculture, whatever they want to say. So no, there are many problems in the socio-cultural and political spheres that directly feed into economic problems.
But do you think that, do you think we could even call ourselves a socially cohesive society at the moment?
No, well, I wouldn't say let's put it like this. There are always in every society differences of opinion. That's a good thing. There are differences of practice. That's a good thing. Whether people listening to this are conservatives or on the left, I think most people who are, shall we say, Democrats, accept that others of different views have a legitimate position. I mean, it's only one or two rather odd MPs that would say they'd never go out with a Tory or something like that. But most people would accept that. There are some people who would hate it if their daughter-in-law or son-in-law was of a different political or ethnic affiliation. Others won't. What I'm talking about is in part a decline in social cohesion because that very democratic tolerance seems to be ebbing.
Yeah.
And there's also linked to that the notion of what is called direct action. The idea that in some way one's own opinions are sufficiently valid that you can use any method in order to stop people. So we could have the farcical situation that the southern stretch of the M25 is closed by pro-abortion people sitting down and the top stretch by anti-abortion people sitting down in the road. But the net effect of it is to sap confidence in legal processes. I think also that the argument that you cannot say something because others may find it disagreeable is one that does affect social cohesion because it's an important aspect of any society, whether the society is your family, your immediate neighbours, or society as a whole, however defined, that you should be able to have an opinion. And a lot of people feel very, very upset if they don't feel that they can express their opinion.
It's interesting because what you say there, because it seems to me that Britain was once, which is all part of cohesion, a very high trust society.
Yeah.
There's a very high trust, great deal of agreement about certain things, and trust in one's neighbours, peers. That seems to have really ebbed, actually, to the point where I'm not even sure you could call us a high trust society anymore.
Well, I think you're right, and it's it's the absence of trust, not simply in the levels that we're thinking about. Is what if you leave a briefcase there, will somebody by accident will somebody steal it, or do you have to keep your eye on your suitcase on the train all the time because there are people? It's not just those kind of illegalities. There is also trust in a broader sense. If you arrange for a few people, neighbours or whatever, to come round for, let's say, dinner or lunch or drinks, are they likely to row with each other because somebody there is not prepared to have somebody else say X, Y, or Z? And I think that is what, and that might sound trivial to listeners. Actually, it isn't trivial because the ability to socialize with people in your own community is an important aspect of the building blocks of society.
Yeah, it is. Now, I was thinking also, similarly, the kind of disintegration of what I would call peer pressure. But so, for example, on a train journey or whatever, sort of bad behavior, maybe once, was antisocial behavior once, people would have frowned on it, maybe looked to each other to have sort of like condemn it. I think that seems to have entirely disappeared, or maybe it's because I'm going to and fro to London, and it's different in London.
Well, it's certainly a problem in London. I mean, just as a minor point, I'm a Londoner by origin. I've written the history of London twice, actually. Just as a minor point, those people, on the tubes, it actually says on some of the seats, please give this seat up if somebody is elderly or pregnant. And, that often just doesn't happen. And, you have to be very careful to whom you wish to say things to because of the danger they might stick a knife in you.
So well, quite. In other words, we're ruled now by fear as opposed to sort of embarrassment or shame. It's pure fear.
Yes, I fear that is the case.
Yeah.
Now, does that vary in different parts of the country? I think it does. I mean, obviously, we always have problems with statistics. Any historian will tell you that there is always the problem of our statistics equally assessed. But I think there's no doubt that there is a sense of that some areas are more dangerous than others. And interestingly enough, this feeds through to population movements within the country. I mean, I live in Devon. Devon is affected at the present moment by very rapid population rise. Now, interestingly, which is immigration into the county. Interestingly enough, that's
way, by the way.
Well, this is it. We're not talking about from outside the country.
No, yeah.
We're talking about people moving from, say, Redbridge or Harrow boroughs in London, or from cities like Birmingham, Wolverhampton, Leicester, because they don't feel comfortable there, whatever that means. And so I think you've got a volatility that you can see in different parts of the country. And you know, obviously the problem is when you make any comments, you know, I published a book with, in fact, American University Press, Indiana, on Britain since 1945, and it's recently gone through a second edition. And actually, I did mention the grooming gangs scandal in Rotherham, and more generally, it wasn't just there, of course. And obviously, one is aware of the situation that if you say certain things, people will accuse you of this, that, and the other. Let us be clear about this. Just as well understood, the majority of people that are unfortunate do not commit crime. The majority of people who are immigrants into this country wish to do better for them and their families. That doesn't mean you should just allow in anybody that wants, but you know that but the problem is that there are particular areas and groups that are a difficulty and that do have particular higher rates of things not going well for them, which are problems for the rest of society. And if one comments on that, people get askance. Well, we shouldn't be askance. So, for example, cousin marriage is a problem in any community. It doesn't matter whether the people are of whatever colour or whatever religion. It is a problem. People ought to be aware of that. You are not per se making an aggressive comment if, when asked about that, you say something.
But the fact is that because of the atmosphere in which we live, people don't address it, cousin marriage, for example, or they don't criticise it. There's this fear somehow of making a moral judgment.
Well, I think partly it's, of course, fear for one's own job.
Yeah.
I mean, if you were let's say you were a sociologist and you were asked to give a course of lectures on modern society, and you were giving a lecture on family structures, I don't think you would find it easy, because what would happen, of course, is you'd have, if you're not careful, a student would complain that this was whatever they chose to define,
Racist or
whatever, or just unpleasant from their point of view, and wow, your career's ended, you're toast. So I think that there is a degree of uneasy. I mean, what is ironic, of course, is if you look back over the last quarter century, a set of comments and views have been criminalized. You know, they've actually now. So I think it's essentially on ethnicity, gender, sexual preference, and religion. You know, and people will have their own views.
Protected characteristics.
Yeah, they'll have their own views on that, and absolutely, you know, this is a democratic society. You can take that up with your MPs and all the rest of it. It's not my job as a commentator to say this is outrageous, though as a libertarian, I actually think it's not a good thing. But it's odd that you could say something like, you know, if you were to make comments on any of those, you'd be in dead trouble. You could have said in 2008-9, kill all the bankers as a result of the financial crisis.
Yes.
Or you could say, you know, I wouldn't sit down for dinner with a Tory.
Yes.
As several, and my God, you're allowed to get away with that.
Yes.
Now, my own view is none of these should be protected characteristics.
Yeah.
We should live in a society which differentiates between things that are said, however abhorrent, and some of them are greatly abhorrent, Holocaust denial, for example. Some of them are greatly abhorrent, but we should distinguish between those and actions which actually hurt other people. That's a different matter. So, for example, and if you lessen that distinction by making all comments a matter of, potentially a large range of comments a matter of criminal offence, then you actually, in a way, diminish the severity as well as actually the police resources that can deal with actions that are really unpleasant. You know, some thug beating up somebody of a different ethnic group, some old lady or some young man who they don't like on that basis. That's wrong. It should be stopped. Those people should be imprisoned. It doesn't matter what colour they are. Yeah. They should be imprisoned. But if somebody's, drunk, says some abusive remark,
yes,
well, they're a boorish person, that's it. There are boorish people in society. Grow up, get used to it.
I remember it used to be a case with our free speech law.
Yes.
It was quite cut and dried, actually, that basically we had free speech, and unless, but we couldn't incite murder or violence towards people, right? Yes. That seemed to me to be a pretty good standard. It's just that it's been expanded now, and you mentioned it there about saying things. Words are now kind of conflated, are they not, with actions, and they're given the same weight as actions.
Yes, I think that's actually risks diminishing the seriousness. So, for example, I've tried in the course of my career to write on some of the more difficult topics out there. So I've done 3 books on slavery or the slave trade. I've done a book on the Holocaust, which has gone into 2 editions. Actually, one of the slave trade ones went into 2 editions. And, these are difficult issues in which people might say things that are really unpleasant. But I think one does still have to distinguish between saying things that are unpleasant and doing something that is deadly.
Yes.
And the argument that by creating by talking about something that is unacceptable, that is, shall we say, by trying to make something unacceptable through language, that you are becoming a threat to society. Well, it's got to be handled very carefully. So let me give you an example. I have no particular brief at the present moment for the Reform political party. I didn't vote for it. I don't wish it any harm. I don't wish any political party any harm. If they are able to win the support of electors, then they should be part of the national debate, whatever I think about them. But there is no doubt at all that the use of the term extreme right or far right about them, for example, by the Mayor of London, is intended to suggest that these people shouldn't really be there, that they shouldn't really be part of the political debate. Now, I think that's unacceptable. Were it to be the case that we're talking about a political movement that was actively taking part in terrorist activities or encouraging them, shall we say provisional Sinn Féin during its period, then I think that was entirely legitimate of the governments of the period, to take steps to ban it and limit its ability to disseminate their opinion.
Yes.
But we're not talking about that.
No.
And yet the language used is intended to suggest that these people are not part of the political debate.
Yes, and they're kind of almost innately morally wrong. It's wicked.
And that you're morally wrong if you even countenance them.
Yes.
So that, for example, were you to be taking part, organising a public debate before the elections, they shouldn't be part of it.
Yeah.
Now, if you think about it, if you go back to the UKIP, I'm happy for you to correct me, but I think I'm right. In 2015, UKIP polled about 14.5% of the vote in the general election.
That's right, yes.
Yep. The idea that in some way this shouldn't be part of the national debate is really quite troubling.
Yes. Oh, it is. But also, I was very involved in UKIP at that time.
Yes.
The funny thing is that with this far-right business, is that they don't even believe it themselves. The people who make those charges, they don't really think reform is right wing. They don't really think half of the things. It's just a way of invalidating, isn't it, any kind of opposition.
Well, it's a way of invalidating opposition. I'm not quite as sanguine as you are.
Right.
I think people are inclined to say that if they disagree with something, they're too inclined in modern Britain, and not just in Britain, let's be clear about this, they're too inclined to say if they disagree with something that it shouldn't be part of the national debate.
Yes.
So that what they're doing is they're going for what it used to be called, or still is called in Germany, the Zeitgeist, the spirit of the age. And the argument is the spirit of the age is what a surprise their views. Therefore, they represent historical destiny, and therefore that is what you should support. Now, that is a view that was very commonplace in political movements in the 19th century, in the 20th century, particularly ones, but not just ones, of an extreme characteristics. Very much part of Marxist-Leninism, of course. And I think you could say it's still there.
Yes. On this issue, by the way, of free speech and shutting people down, when did you retire from academia?
At the end of January 2020.
2020. So, okay, so not that long ago, really. Was it already becoming a difficult situation in the academic world? Because, I mean, we've discussed it so many times on the channel. The very places that are meant to be, crucible of free speech, and if that's the right expression, and we're gradually becoming more and more intolerant. And I just wonder whether that was your experience.
That was certainly my experience. I mean, my experience was one that I found very discouraging in the last years. And I think it's fair to say that in my view, there was not a openness to freedom of expression in the university, and that this for both students and staff, and that this gathered pace it had really affected me and others in the 20-teens, but it gathered pace in the beginning of the 2020s with all sorts of arguments. I mean, I remember, for example, being told, I had suggested that if people were hired from abroad, there should be a requirement pretty quickly that they learnt English. And I was told that this was an unacceptable view.
Really?
And I just thought, well, anyway, I do think there are practical problems. And actually, incidentally, I think that there are I'm not sure always the discussion picks up what's gone on. It's not that there is a central conspiracy sitting there to say, let's make the world more woke. There are a number of things. First of all, there is a kind of sloppy managerialism in not all universities, but in the vast majority of universities, towards a particular set of values and beliefs. These days we would reflect many of them to be diversity and equality, in which there is an attempt to turn a university into a template of what they see of as progressivism. Now, I happen to think this is flawed and foolish. From the student's point of view, it's also resources taken away from teaching and used for other purposes. You get that. You get the fact that the trade union is a pretty militant trade union. Don't think there's anybody who would disagree with that assessment of it. And although many of the academic staff are not members of the union, nevertheless, the only people that the unit vice-chancellors will deal with in negotiations is the union, which I think is the problem. Many undergraduates are not difficult, wokish, or irritating people, but those who tend to become student union heads and spokesmen are. And the combination of those three factors causes enormous problems. I think it's also fair to say that you've got, shall we say, if you have an overwhelming hire of people who are of the particular political persuasion,
Yeah.
which is what's happened in British universities, then you will end up with a situation, and they will regard that as normative, and anybody taking another viewpoint they would regard as difficult.
Yeah.
So I was regarded as difficult. I mean, my crime was that I was a conservative. And as I pointed out at the time, actually, the Conservatives were the government of the country. A lot of people had voted Conservative. I think Theresa May in 2017 got 42% of the vote. I mean, we're talking about a significant amount. Doesn't matter.
Yeah.
And I remember the head of my department saying to me that he didn't like Jeremy Corbyn. He thought he wasn't left-wing enough. And you just thought, I mean, so...
Did you see a big difference? Because I went to university, what was it now, late 70s, early 80s, and it was Kent, which was kind of a lefty place. So it was, students have always been left wing or whatever. But from what I can gather now, I can't remember the actual survey, but it was something like most academics, at least, were, I think it's like 70, 80%. Were not conservative, i.e. on the left. Yeah. And so the amount of conservative academics had really gone down. I mean...
now it's very, very much smaller than that who are conservatives. Much smaller. And the redrawing and the enforced redrawing of curricula is a way to, as it were, provide diktats that marginalise those that are left. No, I mean, I don't think there's any doubt at all about that. And it's difficult because clearly a university degree is a useful thing to have. You can't go into a lot of occupation, can't be in police, nursing, all sorts of things. I'm not sure that the universities are the best custodians at the moment of university degrees. I think that is a practical problem. Yeah. And I don't see any political party having the ability or will to do anything about it.
Well, the Tories did, was it create some kind, it's a fancy, free speech czar or something like that for the university. And then Labour kind of basically just dropped it since when they got in. I mean, this is something that comes up an awful lot. When younger people like my, godsons or whatever it is, asked, should I go to university? I increasingly found myself sort of thinking, actually, of course one would have said, yes, of course you do. But I'm not sure now. I don't know whether, I sort of look at them as young men, for example, and think, you're going to be blamed for all
I was
of the world's problems.
I mean, education should be about helping people to realise their potential. Yeah. That is not done if you are telling them that their potential is inherently flawed because they in some way have, I don't know, an ethnicity that is not acceptable, So I think this is a serious practical issue for the country. I think it's a serious issue more generally at different educational levels because you see some of these, pads. But it's also looping back to what we were talking about earlier. We were discussing why the country was in decline. I mean, let's face it, if a lot of energy is being devoted to those sorts of resources and those sorts of issues, this is not resources devoted to things that you might regard as more appropriate educational outcomes.
Exactly. On the point of education, Jeremy, there's been this reworking, hasn't there, of the curriculum or whatever, or there will be, according to the new government. But history teaching, I mean, how would you teach history in schools? I mean, like secondary schools. Yeah. It seems that now people actually know nothing about their history anymore. I would say there's a deliberate thing there, possibly. I don't know if you'd agree with that. But how could one restore a recorded, unapologetic, traditional teaching chronologically of history? Is that absolutely never going to happen?
Well, I mean, first of all, I just say I was on the committee that reviewed the national curriculum in the early teens. Michael Gove put me on it, and it was one, as you may recall, that was much lambasted by people like Richard Evans, Historical Association, all the establishment. I think it's fair to say, and I remember Michael Gove saying to me, he said that as Secretary of State for Education, he said the subject that causes the most people to write in to the office is history.
Yes.
He said English literature is second. He said nobody seems to write in about the teaching of chemistry.
Right.
So first of all, there is an inherent controversy, and there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, I myself think that an aspect of the teaching of history ought to be to explain to people why it is possible to have different views on some things. Incidentally, that's why I think television history is so terrible. I mean, Simon Sharma, for example, awful historian, because he never says there are different ways of looking at these.
Yes. Yeah.
And, part of history is to explain that there are, causes of the French Revolution. There are different views. If we go to the last revision, and one of the things I suggested was, and I don't disagree, I'm going to come back to what you were saying. One of the things I suggested was that there should be more teaching of local and regional history, that people should know about their own community, and how it had developed, both socially, economically, and in other respects. And I said that was an aspect that we were poor at. I suggested that we needed, I'm very much in favour of national history. I said, obviously, there's only so much time. I suggested we needed more world history, and in order to provide space for that, probably less European history. Not because I was again, in fact, I taught European history and have written histories of France, Germany, Italy, Portugal, Spain, and Europe as a whole, but simply because I said the same thing in the history department in Exeter. I said, it is bizarre to teach a history degree where people have never heard anything about the history of China. So, conversely, maybe you don't need to know about Luther, for example, or quite have such an obsession with redoing, as my children complained about, redoing the Third Reich. But national history, yes, I think we should have national history. And I think national history, it would probably be offered with a different complexion in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and England. No, nothing inherently wrong with that, because national history, British history, does have a different inflection in those ones. But insofar as I can talk about England, because I'm English, not because I'm implying there's anything less consequential about the others, but I think that it is appropriate for students who are educated in Britain, whatever their ethnic or national or religious origins, that they should understand the development of the political system in this country, that they should understand Britain in the world, that they should understand the basis of the development of the British economy and society, and that they should understand key aspects of British cultural history. And I think those are all important, and I think that they should be offered without some sense. You referred to the idea of apology. I don't think it is appropriate to offer them in a sense of apology. I've always taken the view that we don't believe in inherited guilt, whatever that means. So, for example, today we would not enslave people, just wouldn't do it. But there's no reason to say that because people did it in the 18th century, that therefore we should be spending all our time apologizing for it. It was what happened. Coerced labor was very common around the world in that period. Slavery was very common. You understand slavery much better, not that it's attractive, it's very unattractive, but you understand it much better if you see it as a coercive labor system, not restricted to the Atlantic world. The thing that was most different, as I've argued in my books, about the coercive labor systems of slavery in the New World is most slaves were private slaves. Right. There were some state slaves. For example, British dockyards at Antigua had some slaves, and comparably in other countries. But whereas in, for example, the Ottoman Empire, Turkey, large numbers of state slaves, whereas in, say, ancient Rome or Athens, large numbers of state slaves. But that doesn't inherently mean there was something better or worse about the British system. Serfdom, abolished in Russia in 1861, that should be part of the discussion if you're talking about slavery. So you get the idea.
Yes.
And then you could argue, if you wish to take it further, that public slavery continued into the 20th century and indeed today.
Yes.
People in the Soviet gulags, people in those that weren't being killed once, or slaughtered, I should say, at once, in the German concentration camps. You might argue the entire population of North Korea today are slaves. And yet the interesting thing is, you could doubtless get people to demonstrate in London about something that allegedly we should be apologizing for, but actually for them to get their head round the fact that slavery still exists today. The UN estimates it at over 20 million.
Yes, 20. Yeah.
And it's, in a way, beating up on the past is not terribly mature. So I would not, if I was teaching history today, I would not be doing it as a form of beating up on the past. I think you can explain why people do things without necessarily justifying it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, actually, before going, that's a very interesting point, hadn't occurred to me, about state and private slavery, actually. Just as a point, I would say there are a lot of people who might demonstrate, or younger, who will know about the transatlantic slave trade, i.e. Britain, America. They won't know about any other slavery, and most importantly, they won't know about the abolition of slavery.
Yes. Well, also, I mean, the interesting thing is this. I taught full-time from 1980 to 2020, and one of the things as a historian you should be aware of, I say that because many historians don't sufficiently, is how we're all part, all of us, listeners as well, of values and understandings, interpretations changing. So in the 1980s and 90s, and lasting to a certain extent after that, a big thing was world history. And the argument was that there had been insufficient attention to societies elsewhere in the world. And in looking at world history, what people were looking at, in many respects, were linkages. So if you take the slave trade, you've got books on the slave trade discussing the extent to which there was, as it were, an economic pattern in which Africans enslaved other Africans, sold them to Europeans, etc., that this was how it worked. Now, of course, if you have a politicized history, that's not acceptable. So one of the interesting things is on the slave trade itself is I would say that many people are not aware of the extent of African agency. They aren't aware that there were many other slave trades. I mean, I took part in a debate once in the British Museum in which one of the other speakers, in complete ignorance, said the British invented slavery. And you just thought, even in the Atlantic slave trade, where the British were the dominant slavers by the 18th century, I mean, there was the Portuguese were the first major ones, and et cetera. So I think that you're right. There is a lack of contextual understanding. I think that's a real problem. I ought to tell you this. It's also a problem among many academics. Right. Unfortunately, if you say to somebody, I mean, my classic example of that is American historians, by which I mean historians of America. I don't mean those resident of the United States. If you ask them a question about Canada, which is interesting, expansion westwards in Canada, or the impact of settlement policies, attitudes to the local population, the impact of the railway, many of the same tendencies. And you ask them a comparative question, they'll say, I don't know anything about Canada. And you just think, grow up, you see.
Yeah.
Yes. And I think there is a failure of contextualization So, I've written a book recently on the impact of reasons for the development of the Industrial Revolution in Britain.
Going to mention that.
And, I very much emphasize the significance of social and political patterns in Britain, and insofar one's talking about resources, I talk about coal. And you might say to me, people have said to me, well, why aren't you saying more about slavery? I mean, there is a chapter on slavery. And I would say, well, it's quite simple, actually. If slavery caused the Industrial Revolution, why didn't it happen in Portugal?
Yes.
Exactly.
Exactly.
So you have to be able to contextualize, but you need to be wide-ranging. I mean, it is hard work doing history well. Part of the skill of all of us is to try and make whatever we have as our specialism look easy. Actually, it's extraordinarily hard work to be able to think through things in a contextual fashion.
Completely. With this book, the book is what the title of the book as well. Is
Why the Industrial Revolution happened in Britain.
Yeah. And I saw a short film we did for the BBC actually.
Yeah.
When you're talking about, which again is news to me, about coal being relatively near to the surface.
Yes.
In this country, very, very useful. But obviously, me in my super proud way tends to think it's because we've got innate inventiveness.
Well, that was important. I mean, in a sense, Britain, there were many disadvantages, obviously. And we're talking about comparators. But if you're looking at, say, 1750, let's take England or Britain in 1750. It is not a surprise that continental commentators in the 1720s, both Voltaire and Montesquieu, saw Britain as a dynamic country, because what they saw there was a society that was open to talent. They were particularly impressed by the degree that alongside a national church, which in England was the Church of England, in Scotland, of course, the Church of Scotland was Presbyterian, which is different, there was also the possibility of religious freedoms for others. That there was a rule of law which was open to all. Now, clearly you can say now, as we would say, as is equally true today or in any other society, if you're more articulate, you are always going to be able to do better. But the fact of the matter, again, is you have to look at this in a comparative basis. It was a freer society. It was a society with relatively low tax rates. It was a society, England and Scotland, without internal tariff boundaries. Again, rather like America today in that respect. And I think that it was a society in which talent was rewarded. I mean, it's very interesting. Thomas Jefferson came to Britain, I should say, or England, in the 1780s. And he was the American ambassador in Paris. He, of course, had been very unsympathetic about George III in the day. And he and John Adams was the American ambassador in London, go on a tour. What do they want to see? They want to see two things. One, a distinctive newish feature of British culture, English culture, because they only get as far north as Birmingham, that's why I'm saying English, which is country house gardens. Totally different to the regimented gardens of France. The second thing is they want to see the new industrial sites.
Yes.
They go to James Watt's works at Birmingham, at Soho, just part of Birmingham, to see it. They go to see the new Albion flour mill, the largest factory in the steam-powered factory in the world at that stage, in London. And Matthew Bolton comes up with his famous line, which really impresses them. What I sell here, sir, is what every man wants. What I sell here, sir, is power. In other words, steam engines. Yeah. They are looking at the new. Britain was a society of the new. London was the New York of 1960, the Shanghai maybe of 2010.
Yeah.
And looping back to what I was talking about at the very beginning, there wasn't a museum quality.
Right.
So they wanted to see new industrial works. If they were seeing new public works, they were new things. The Bank of England,
Yes,
public finance, the new bridge that was being thrown up at Westminster, and the second bridge across the Thames, a modern style bridge, not like the old London Bridge. They want to see new things. And in a way, one of the things that's very dispiriting now is the extent to which the obsession with fighting out critical accounts of British society, none of it is really to do with helping the British engage with the future.
Yes, because they don't care about that. I mean, that's why.
Well, of course, you've got a lot of people that are hopelessly ignorant of how economics work. They don't understand capitalism. They don't understand the notion of return on capital. They don't understand the value of profit. They don't understand the nature of risk. Now, one of the problems is a lot of people in the public sector have never had to do any of this. And I always take the view that the people that work hardest and should be remunerated better as a result are not people for whom the customers are thrown at them, let's say doctors or academics, teachers, whatever. They are people that have to go and create the business as well as do it.
Yeah.
And that if they don't, the company goes bust and they go to the wall.
Yes.
Now, let's face it, everybody agrees that many things in British society in the state sector are not doing very well at the moment. None of them are going to go bust and go to the wall.
Oh, no, quite. And it's amazing how the scales have completely gone up the other way from when I was growing up. But with your this book about the Industrial Revolution, and for that matter, your other books, where can people get them? On Amazon?
I assume so.
You don't think you're interested in that kind of part of it, or?
Well, no. I mean, look, all books are available on Amazon as far as I'm aware.
Yeah.
I prefer it if people go to a bookshop because simply I think bookshops, like libraries, are important to our society. I'd rather somebody didn't buy my books and got them from a library, keeping a library alive.
Right.
But so I think, and I always find it rather disagreeable listening to authors at book festivals telling you need to buy the book. No, what they should be telling you is you need to read the book.
Oh, yes.
Okay,
major difference. Major difference.
Of the ones that I've done most recently that I think are really very, very, very impressive, I did a book which came out the end of last year, published by the British Library, called Railway History in 100 Maps.
All right.
Which was praised kindly by Simon Heffer in the Telegraph. And it is, forget about what I've written, it is a wonderful book because for 40 quid, which is a lot of money, but they produced a hardback with the most wonderful illustrations of the maps, as well as about 80,000 words written by me, which is a history of railways. And that follows one I did in the same series on World War II, which they've paperbacked and is out at 25 quid. And one that I've done on British history. Now, I love maps. I've done a lot of books about maps. I've also done a book called Maps in History, a map called Maps in Politics. I've edited atlases. I edited the Dawn Kindersley Atlas of World History.
Oh, yes.
I'm really interested in maps. And if people out there that, if you're interested in books, obviously I've written a lot of them. Obviously, I'd like to think they're an education. I've also produced a lot of podcasts, some of which can be followed on my website. And I think there's 208 on there. So,
Jerry, would you, we have just a couple of questions one question really for our members, but thank you very much for coming. It's fascinating, actually. Jeremy back there. We shall see you next week. In the meantime, have a good week, won't you? Take care. Bye-bye. Hello. If you're enjoying the New Culture Forum channel and you believe in our mission, may I invite you to join our membership scheme at the link below or on our website, newcultureforum.org.uk. Our work is more important now than ever, and we have great plans ahead for the future, but we can't do it without your support. From as little as £3 per month, you can help ensure that we continue on our mission. As a member, you'll receive a range of benefits, including access to exclusive content, invitations to our private events, including here at our studios, free copies of our books, and much, much more, including, of course, our famous NCF mug. If you aren't able to become a member, then please help us by clicking this button and subscribing to our channel. It's completely free. Just remember to also click the bell icon so that you can get notifications when we post new videos. Thank you.